The Liberal government announces their first-time home buyers incentive, and the SNC fallout continues to rain down. I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. Seems like we can't get enough of the Liberal government. They're always in the news for something these days, and today it's for something really interesting. It's their federal budget that they've proposed, and it comes with something called the First-Time Home Buyers Incentive. What this is, it's a program that encourages people to become first-time home buyers. As a result, it's only applicable to people who've never bought a house before, highly targeted towards millennials and young people. What it is it's sort of a shared equity you get with the government when you purchase a house. So not like a loan. What happens is when you purchase a house, the government will help you pay for 10% if it's a new home, or 5% if it's a pre-existing house that you're buying secondhand. And the 10%, you never have to pay back until you sell the house. You can imagine the government owning 10% of your property basically, and when you sell it, they're entitled to some of those gains. It's really cool because to us, it sounds amazing. It's basically a free lump sum of money that you never have to pay back if you don't sell your house. That comes in combination with a second change they made, which was in addition to the amount of your RRSP that you can put towards purchasing a house. So originally the RRSP is a registered retirement saving plan, and it's really for your retirement. But previous to this, you could put up to $25,000 of the RRSP into a home purchase. Now they've upped that amount to $35,000, giving you a little bit more money that you can withdraw from these tax-free accounts to invest into your house. And this is actually a really concrete move, I feel. The second piece of it, at least, the RRSP. It lets you take more of the money that you've saved up and put it towards a goal such as buying a house. Because let's face it, the RRSP these days, people are retiring later and later. It becomes less necessary for you to save large sums of money because a lot of people will continue to work into their late 60s. It's more beneficial to the working class to be able to take more of that money out sooner so they can put it towards something that they need now, such as a house. But don't get me wrong, it's still equally important to save up for retirement, but by getting your house sooner, a lot of people don't realize that the house is probably one of the biggest components of a person's net worth. These houses appreciate with time, typically, and by the time you're ready for retirement and your kids have moved out, you can actually sell the house, move into a smaller place like an apartment or a condo, and with that profit, you can reinvest it into your savings account or just live off it pretty much. But the funny part about this recent change to the RRSP is being drowned out by the first-time home buyers incentive because everyone's going crazy about that. On its face, it's a really attractive move. Everyone wants to pay less for housing. They don't want to spend a lot. They all want a house. But if you dig a little bit deeper into the consequences of the first-time home buyer incentive, you might realize it's a little bit more gruesome than it appears on face value. Before we talk a little bit more about the home buyers incentive, I want to bring our attention to a document that RBC released concurrently with the announcement of the federal Liberal budget. This document gave everyone a rough idea of how exactly the Canadian housing market looks like today. It turns out there is substantial data to disprove a lot of people's cognitions of the current market environment. It's not as grim as it seems. So, first of all, in the document, the first thing that they wanted to note was that over 40% of people who are under 35 and are living inside a home own it. So, home ownership among millennials is about 40%. 4 out of 10 people own the house they live in. The rest are renting it or splitting the share of the costs among bigger groups, things like that. And if you expand the data to Toronto by removing the age limits, 66.5% of people own their houses. In Calgary, the number jumps to 73%. So that's a low end, Toronto, Vancouver, places where it's more expensive. And there is something on the high end, Calgary, 73. It's not too much of a big difference. It's less than 10% of a change. And then RBC compared it to something like Paris, a place with a real housing crisis. Only 33.2% of people own their house in Paris. So there's been a recent decline in home ownership within Canadian houses, but these figures they released were meant to explain to you that things aren't as grim as it seems. It feels like the Liberal government and a lot of interest groups are painting a picture where housing prices are so high that it's literally impossible for millennials to own a house in today's day and age. But according to data provided by RBC via their economic department, that's simply not true. 40% of people can actually own their house, and the number increases as age goes on, which makes a lot of sense. People save more money and they can still do these things. But the raising house prices is definitely an issue, but that's not the only thing that needs to be tackled. If you look at the problem as a whole, at its crux, it's really a supply versus demand scenario, and using that framework will help us illustrate why this announcement of the housing incentive can actually do more harm than good. One of the compounding effects of the growing prices for real estate in places like Toronto, Vancouver, and the GTA is not really only inflation, it's actually a lack of supply. Everyone wants to live in Toronto, everyone wants to live in Vancouver. Nobody really wants to go to Calgary. I'm sorry to any Calgary listeners, not meant to offend you, but this is just the facts of the situation. Due to this extremely high demand for certain locations, the supply is not able to keep up because the demand is growing astronomically, and supply can only change as fast as construction companies are willing to build houses or condos or apartments, and it's a slow process too. These things aren't built up in a matter of months. It usually takes years for them to catch up. So you could see why supply is typically always lagging demand in these situations. And the incentive is doing more to increase demand and not tackle the supply side of the issue. Think about it. Look at the effects of the incentive. First of all, it allows people to get more access to capital so they can bid more for these houses. If the government is willing to subsidize 10% of the costs of your housing expense, you can theoretically increase your bidding price by upwards of about 10%. This applies to not only you though, it applies to everyone. If you increase everyone's bidding power for a supply of finite resources, the prices will undoubtedly grow up, especially in the short term, because as we already pointed out, these construction companies aren't going to be able to create more units to match demand instantaneously. This government comes into power in October if they are voted in, but it won't be a matter of 6 months for these companies to get more housing units available. So in the short term, prices will jump up astronomically. If you thought things were expensive before, imagine now when people have a 10% incentive that they can use to up their spending power. Things will be insane, and you'll be competing with more players now for the same amount of resources. Due to the nature of this incentive, I don't really see it moving the needle too much in the housing issue. It seems like things are going to remain the same, extremely high prices. It's just that you're going to be playing with much higher numbers now. This is why I think the RRSP was a far wiser move, and maybe we can look into that a little bit more, because this doesn't apply to everyone. It does in the terms of anyone can take advantage of it, but to make use of the extra $10,000 allotted to you now to use a home buying purchase from the RRSP, you have to at least have saved that money in your account. It rewards people who have saved, and due to this, there is less players now who can take advantage. This housing incentive applies to any first-time home buyer. Pretty much the equivalent of that saying that a rising tide will raise all the boats in the ocean. All the players are going to be able to bid more now, and it doesn't really help solve any issues per se. Another oversight in the budget, if you break it down financially, they budgeted for an expense equivalent to an average household value of $500,000, but this obviously does not apply to all of Canada. Look at places like the GTA or Vancouver. $500,000 really can get you anything, but interestingly enough, if you take out Toronto and Vancouver from the average prices of homes in Canada, it's only an average of $370,000 to purchase a home. So it's really interesting. $500,000 isn't enough for a place in Toronto or Vancouver, but it's actually way above the average for places outside of those areas. They took this weird figure, and it seems like they would have been better off calculating a budget for each individual province according to the cost of living differences within them instead of doing an average. It seems like the governments are in love with amalgamation all of a sudden. So despite those first 2 points, I'm not really for or against the initiative in essence, because to me, it seems like it won't really help too many people. On its face value, it's a very, very attractive policy. People are falling in love with it because of what it promises you. But in terms of delivery, I feel like it just won't be there for the reasons I explained. The whole demand versus supply side economics aren't equaling out. But there's a far more sinister side effect that could take a hold of people because of the incentive. And that concept really lies in the root word of incentive. It's going to encourage people to purchase houses. That's really what the motive of the plan is, to get more people, young people, millennials, to purchase a home for the first time. But this compounds a far more complex issue that's currently taking hold of Canada, and that is debt, household debt. Due to this incentive, how many people who can't really afford a house are going to be encouraged to just do it because they don't want to miss out on this incentive? As we know, in Canada, the government shifts every 4 years. By the time the Conservatives come into power, let's assume the Liberals do win the election and they implement this. If you wait around 4 years for the government to change, people are going to be all up in arms because it's very likely the Conservatives would strike this down. You don't want to be missing out on that sweet 10% incentive. So what's going to happen? People are going to be super motivated to make short-term purchases. And guess what? Those short-term purchases will not be able to be accommodated by the supply side, as we've laid out. The construction companies who make the houses will not be able to construct enough homes in the short term to amount for the radically increasing demand due to the incentive. As a result, you may end up taking a loan that's far greater than you would have if you didn't even have the incentive. It's a very possible scenario. And now, what will you be in? You'll be in a situation with an extremely high debt, paying extremely high interest. The only difference is the Ontario government, or my apologies, not the Ontario government, the federal government will own 10% of your land. So even when you do sell it, you owe them money now too. It doesn't seem like that ideal of a situation to me. Now, let's look at a worse situation. Let's say you take this loan on and you're struggling to make ends meet and you can't even pay the bills. Your house gets repossessed. That's terrible for you. You have essentially drowned out all your money and you are in debt and you're about to be repossessed with nowhere to live because you purchased the house, which price was driven up by an insane increase in demand for housing due to the incentive. Now, that's only on the individual basis. What happens when tens of thousands of people can't pay back their loans to the bank? Hello, 2008 financial crisis that was caused largely in part due to subprime mortgages being available to people and those people not being able to pay them back. The banks tried to recall everything and they couldn't. People just couldn't pay it back. There was no money in the bank. Some people went to go make withdrawals. They couldn't pay those people. Lots of financial institutions entered bankruptcy and it caused a massive downturn in the economy that was crippling to dozens of people. Far more than dozens, actually. That was a far underestimation by me. Literally millions of people were affected by that crisis, and you could even look back on historical data. That's how you get housing prices to really go down if you want to. Places were losing up to 50, 60, 70% of their value because no one could afford anything. If you compare the pros and the cons of this initiative, it seems like the pros are there. Don't get me wrong. I actually do want to own a house, and I'm sure a lot of my peers would like to as well, being young people. But look at the cost of the initiative. This is not the right way to go about implementing a policy to make that happen. If, on the worst case scenario, which I've just outlined, we could be looking at a disaster. And it really comes down to people who can't even afford a house will be incentivized to start getting houses because they don't want to miss out on this 10% basically free loan that the government's giving out. They're incentivizing everyone, even those people who can't afford a house. I can already imagine people first year out of university are going to be trying to buy a house if this comes into play because it's just so attractive. There are far more practical ways to get the housing issue under control. I feel like the answer to that lies on the supply side of the economics, not the demand. All that the government's really doing is shooting up demand. I think things like the Affordable Housing Act are positive steps forward. I think that building up quality suburbs in places that are not as developed now to get demand away from places like Toronto and Vancouver would be great. Raise supply up in these places, make it good quality, and draw consumers to them. This entire promise, though, draws a really clear distinction that you need to make with politics. Every politician wants to promise you the bells and the whistles because they want to get voted in. They can make a lot of promises that sound really amazing to you. How about free education? How about a free car? How about a free house? How about a free everything? How about everything becomes amazing and rainbows? Well, obviously those things sound amazing, and it's our nature as humans to be drawn to things like that. But there's always a cost to these promises. Sometimes the cost is they never deliver. Sometimes they just lie to you to get your votes. But sometimes they can really mean things, and this is one of those situations which I think they do mean it. And you have to think about things deeply. Don't let your short-sighted need or short-sighted wants cloud your vision of the entire bargain. You need to see the big picture in politics, and that's how you make an informed decision. Be aware of the pros and the cons. It's perfectly fine for you to be in favor of this incentive, but just be able to rationalize why and be willing to acknowledge the downsides to it. To you, if you think the pros outweigh the cons, that's fine, but just be aware of them is all I'm saying. So, given that, let's be honest now. Why did the Liberal government choose now to include such a radical policy into their platform? Radical in a good way, I mean. It's a beautiful promise to make to people. I wonder why. Maybe because it shifts the narrative away from SNC. Nobody's really talking about that anymore. Instead, everyone's focused on the wonderful promises that Mr. Justin Trudeau has made. You need to be aware of that because I feel like it's a ploy. It's a smokescreen. The whistles and the bells are coming out now. Look at this. Don't worry about what just happened a couple weeks ago. Don't worry about those hearings that I'm shutting down. Well, we're going to get more into the SNC fallout that continues after this segment, but there's a lot of things that are still happening with that, but they're getting drowned out now by these new campaign promises. It's a very interesting strategy, and it seems to be working, but I'm trying to get you to be aware of these things. Since we were just talking about it, now probably is a good time to move on to the SNC part of the day. So, the scandal continues to unfold, I guess. We're learning more and more things every day. Quick update, a fourth high-ranking official has resigned from the Liberal Party's workings. That makes 4 people now who have resigned over the SNC scandal. This is literally unprecedented. When have you seen this before? Justin Trudeau appointed a lot of these people, which means he obviously felt fondly about them, and they're falling off left and right. If that's not a clear indication to you that something is not right here, I don't know what to tell you. You need a wake-up call. So here are the latest updates on the situation. The former Attorney General, who also resigned, is now saying she has more to say. She wants to come back and testify in front of everyone to give the remainder of her story. But the Justice Committee, which is majority Liberals, have rejected that. Their stance on the issue is we've heard enough, we don't want to hear any more, let people make their assumptions from what's available. To me, that is ludicrous. If you have already heard enough and there's nothing more to say, let her go on stage then. If she ends up repeating herself, it's going to turn people off. People are going to be like, there's nothing more. Why is she here again? She's trying to fan the flames. And that's how you get the tide of public opinion to turn in your favor. If you truly have nothing to hide, let it happen. This whole process will not take too long. Let her go on the microphone, maximum 1 hour, she can tell her tale. The public is very good at responding to things that they find to be bullshit. But what's really bullshit here is the fact that it's been rejected. To not even let her get a chance to go on stage when she says that she has something new to say. These guys are sweating. People that keep falling off left and right. So to me, it's extremely concerning. And I think more government officials need to stand up to them. The one thing that the Conservative Party, I think, is doing well is they're applying pressure to the Liberals. So when the Liberals introduced their federal budget, the Conservatives started clapping their hands, making a lot of noise. So, okay, let me get one thing straight. I don't think that the government is a place for such childish ruckus. But you kind of have to do what you got to do when the Liberal Party and the Justice Committee is acting so shady. So they started causing a big scene. While the Liberals were trying to present their budget, they weren't having it. And then they walked out. So it kind of sucks because the Conservatives weren't really there to become aware of what was in the federal budget. I'm sure after they looked it up and they figured things out, but at least they're trying to keep attention on the SNC scandal because to me, it feels like it's fading away. And if you want to talk about motives, what greater motive does the Justice Committee have that's majority Liberal to not allow the former Attorney General to give her testimony? Because they just announced the federal budget that has the first-time home buyers incentive and a plethora of other, I guess you could call it attractive spending things that people want to see. We didn't go too in-depth into the other things because we're limited by time here, but there's a lot of good spending things that are in that budget. And that's really the thing with politics and news in general. The most recent information that's at the forefront of the media is typically what's going to get picked up upon by the masses. Right now, the Liberals are looking good. They have these policies in place. They're going to be spending a lot of money. They're going to help you get a house. They obviously do not want the SNC scandal to crop back up again, blow up in their faces, and take over the news media because it will drown out the first-time home buyer incentive. And honestly, it might even make it ineffective because, as I've said, the most prominent things in the media are usually the most recent updates. If people start talking about SNC again, this first-time home buyer incentive will take a back seat. People might start forgetting about it. People might not even care about it anymore if the full extent of the corruption that occurred here with SNC is actually released. It'll be really interesting to see how that unfolds in the coming weeks. So I'm going to end the episode today with one thing I find really interesting, and that is the international Brexit situation. So there was a recent petition passed around Britain, and it was about this time remaining in the EU. And in just one day, guess how many signatures that thing got? I'll give you a second. Think about it. It was over 2 million people signed that petition to remain in the EU. It seems like Britain's having a change of heart, and I'm probably going to detail that in a later episode, but the real issue was Theresa May, the PM. She tried to cater to a bunch of different audiences with her bill, because with the whole Brexit situation, there was a couple of different interest parties. There were the hard Brexiters who wanted to move away from the EU completely. They wanted no ties. Then there were people on the other side who still wanted to remain. And her deal that got rejected the first time was kind of in the middle. It wasn't a full Brexit and it wasn't a complete stay either, because there was things like the backdrop. So that failed. And she came with a second bill and it failed again. Now she's trying to get a third bill out. Honestly, I don't see it happening. She's lost a lot of trust. People from her own party actually voted against her own bills. She's trying to cater to a lot of people without really understanding what they want. So not being handled well over there. Brexit has been a colossal failure, and it's just kind of interesting to see the updates as they keep flowing in. 2 million people now want to stay, and that's only after one day. I imagine this thing getting far more votes and signatures now that's become popular. So that about wraps it up for me. Thank you for joining me on the Perri platform. I'll see you soon.